Well, folks, we've got 9 more mini set cards to discuss. This is Drown, and it has the old card Entomb in Shambles, I think. This is a 4 mana spell for Priest. It's a shadow spell, and it reads, put an enemy minion on the bottom of your deck. So really good, just universal single target removal here. Plays around things like death rattles, for instance. You're not activating death rattles because the minion's not dying. You're also technically gaining a resource, much like Entomb back in the day. But instead of shuffling it, this is putting it on the bottom of your deck, which could be good, could be bad, depending on specific scenarios. Number one, you can dredge that up if it's a minion you really want. Otherwise, it might actually interrupt a dredge a little bit if you had other things you wanted to dredge. If you don't have dredge, it might take a while to get that minion, which might be bad if you want it, but could also be good if you don't want it and you're just trying to get rid of it. So depending on the situation, it kind of just, matchup and game state dependent, whether that's good or bad. But nonetheless, just a very efficient single target removal at 4. And we have certainly seen some of these in the past, cards like Polymorph back in the day. It's, very, very similar to a card like this one, just dealing with your opponent's big scary thing. And they've been good. It's a little slower in the current world of Hearthstone. And right now in this meta, we don't have a lot of big crazy things that hit the board early that would be perfectly suitable for Drown. Even cards like Colossals, if they get cheated out, have other body parts you want to deal with instead of just one big single threat. So I don't really see this being run now, but if we go back into a world where, 8/8 giants are getting dropped in the mid game, this could be a great answer to those. So it's one of those cards that it's fine. It'll slot in occasionally when metas demand it, and a control priest just needs that. It could be a quest priest 4-drop as well if you need to be more reactive as opposed to proactive. So totally fine card. So next up, here's a really cool card. This is Disarming Elemental, a 4/4 4-mana card for priest. It's an elemental. You never would have guessed based on the name. And it reads, Battlecry, dredge for your opponent and then set its cost to 6. So this is like really screwing up your opponent's next draw. So not only do you get to pick the worst card for the game state or just generally the lowest power card, but you also potentially get to increase the cost of that card notably, which could do things like mess up their combos or just make them take a really down turn, essentially, by having to spend a lot of mana on a card they otherwise wanted to play, and now it's super expensive. Of course, if you only find 3 super high cost things, or the thing you want to give them is high cost because it's turn 4, and I want to give them an 8-drop because they're not going to be able to play that for a while, you could inadvertently sort of discount it for them. That would occasionally be the correct play, but often you probably just want to take something small and make it really big, kind of limiting their use of that resource. And, attached to a 4/4 body, that's a good starting point for a disruptive effect like this one. Now, it's not totally dealing with the card or removing it. It might break some combos based on break points. It's like, oh, now that costs 6, they literally can't do their one-turn combo sort of thing. Let's make their Moonfire cost 6, for instance. That's kind of a nightmare scenario for some decks. But most of the time, you're probably just going to kind of be slowing them down or maybe just taking that card out of action for the most part, because they'll never want to spend that much mana. That means this is a fitting card for something like a Quest Priest, maybe just a card to play on 4. Sometimes that's useful if this is the best option for just a tempo 4-drop. Quest Priest might love that sort of thing. So again, I don't think this will show up in every meta or every priest deck, but very occasionally, it's a totally fine card, again, at the 4-mana slot. And honestly, I could see both of these at a Quest Priest list, just depending on how reactive versus proactive you need to be in a given meta. And then our last priest card is the Herald of Light. Good old Herald here. It's a 3-mana 3/4, a Naga, and it reads, Battlecry, if you've cast a holy spell while holding this, restore 6 health to all friendly characters. So really just cheap, efficient heal here. They can both stabilize your board if it's been damaged a little bit, or of course heal you in the face, kind of that, anti-heal bot effect here almost on a 3-drop. That's pretty nice. Efficient heal. It's also got a Naga tag, so we've seen Naga Priest floating around. That does not feel like the kind of card that would fit particularly well in Naga Priest as far as I'm concerned. It's a little bit too expensive and not quite interactive enough with your spells. Yes, the effect would go off. Occasionally the healing would matter for minions on board, but often if you've got those minions on board that are already big, where a 6 health heal would be meaningful, you're probably looking to turn the corner and end the game, and I don't think this card really offers a lot there. It just takes up an awkward spot in the list that you'd rather just have for something that generates more cards or card draw or more spells, that sort of thing, feeding into the game plan more directly. So that leaves this for maybe some deck that just needs a lot of healing. Some deck that just needs to play 3-drops like a Quest Priest again. I think there's probably still better options in most cases than the Herald of Light. But if we get some heal synergy thing specifically coming along later and you just need a lot of heals in your deck, maybe Herald of Light makes the cut. But otherwise, this just feels kind of underwhelming. I know that like the stats are good, it's cheap, it's a heal, all of those things are great. Like, 3 or 4 years ago, it'd be like, oh my God, this card does so much. Nowadays, it does a lot, but maybe not in the right directions. In other words, it's just kind of not driving any game plan. It's just sort of acceptable and okay. Probably awesome in something like Arena if you have a Holy Spell laying around. I always feel weird saying cards like this are like underwhelming, but I kind of just think it is these days. All right, moving over to Paladin here, we have the Light Ray, and I'm in a 5/5 elemental with Taunt and costs 1 less for each Paladin card you've played this game. So kind of like a pure Paladin, but not limiting you, just encouraging you to play more Paladin cards. And of course, ideally, this will get very cheap if you play a lot of cheap cards that are Paladin cards very quickly. So, for instance, one Maki Roll cycle on like turn 5 could discount this by 5. If you're willing to waste a turn playing Maki Rolls, which, might be iffy, I think you're probably better off just playing low cost cards that are going to sacrifice a lot of tempo so that you can use this as a follow-up. And the way Paladin's currently structured with like all these kind of early to mid game hand buff cards, I don't think this gets discounted quite quickly enough to fit into that deck because they're like playing 2s on 2 and 3s on 3. I think you probably want to be weaving in 1 mana cards and 2 mana cards more regularly to get this down in the mid game, because I think this needs to be around turn 5, maybe 6 to feel really impactful. As it pushes to like 6, 7, 8, 9, it's just going to be too slow to really make a difference. And if you're just playing 1 card per turn, it takes a while to discount this. So, even 2 cards per turn still takes a little while to get things rolling. But I think you need a pretty low curve deck to really make this thing efficient, which doesn't line up currently, but there are certainly possibilities in Paladin with things like 1 mana secrets. We've even got like the Paladin quest line hanging around that encourages you to play 1 mana cards as well. I don't know if there's enough in Paladin versus neutral, but those are the different kinds of angles that might support a card like Light Ray. Now, my instincts tell me this one's going to be just a little bit too slow compared to like Thing from Below, that started cheaper, maybe a little bit harder to activate, but that card felt good a long time ago. Is this going to feel good as a potentially slower version nowadays? I don't think so. That said, there's always hope because cost discounts can often be abused in Hearthstone. And if you do like have this in a hand buff deck and start rolling really quickly, dropping in 8/8 for 0 mana often feels good. Just maybe a little too late. Next up, here's a crazy spell. This is Front Lines, a 9 mana Paladin spell that summons a minion from each player's deck and then repeats until either side of the battlefield is full. So theoretically, playing this on an empty board, you could have 7 minions facing off against 7 minions, which sounds absolutely bonkers. And theoretically, the goal would be like you have a lot of big stuff and your opponent has a lot of small stuff, and you summon some like gigantic 10-drop taunts and rush minions, and they just get garbage 1-drops and 2-drops because they're a stupid aggro deck. Now, the reality, of course, is much different because you can't really afford to run like 7 gigantic minions in your deck. If you do, you're going to draw a lot of them by the time you get to turn 9. So realistically, I think you're usually going to get like a couple minions on board before you run out. Your opponent may or may not run out. They may just keep summoning stuff and you may fall behind. On top of that, this just comes so late in the game. Like, is it going to be swingy enough? Maybe by then your opponent will be out of minions is your hope and you will not. I think that's pretty unlikely. Any deck that's not running just exclusively big stuff is going to have less of a reward here for this, and it's going to be harder for them to play. So without some way to cheat this out and having like a really perfectly constructed deck list, I just don't see how you're really going to make this card succeed. It feels like there's a lot of challenges to overcome, both from getting the deck structure right and like something that supports a 9 mana card. Like that alone is pretty difficult to achieve, but then also getting like, a point where you're alive at that stage of the game. And your opponent's deck's not going to punish you too much because ultimately, at the end of the day, your opponent gets to attack with this board before you do. Unless, you have rush specifically, you're going to summon a bunch of minions that can't attack and then pass initiative back to your opponent, and they're going to get to dictate how they go through that board. And maybe your stuff's big enough to overwhelm them, but again, that comes back to building a deck that makes sense and having the time to do all this, which is a challenge. So I just don't really know how Front Lines is going to get there. This feels very big, very awkward, and just super risky. So our final Paladin card might be one that's actually good with Holy Maki Roll. This is the Myrmidon, a 3-mana 3/4 Naga for Paladin. It reads, after you cast a spell on this minion, draw a card. So this is a really interesting card draw engine. Again, a single Maki Roll could draw you 7 cards on the back of a Myrmidon. If you're willing to give up an entire turn just drawing cards, this could be that tool. I think more reliably and more consistently, it's just like 1 or 2 buffs on this. You know, use a noble mount on this. Might be pretty awkward for your opponent to kill because it's just like, ah, man, 5 health, Defiant Shield. That's tough to deal with. It sticks around for a turn, then you stack another buff on it that creates some additional survivability. And maybe just drawing like 2 or 3 cards off this is a really good result when you're still getting to play towards your buffs and your normal game plan. Using this as a little bit of a refuel as opposed to like just a big card dump, but it would still have that potential out. If you had a Maki Roll laying around and just needed a refill and had some time, it's possible with a card like Myrmidon. So will this make its way into a deck that's utilizing targeted buffs? Potentially. Right now, Paladin's playing a little bit more for hand buff as opposed to on-board buff, but that could always shift with metas and new card releases. And I think even though I don't see this fitting in just perfectly today, this is the kind of card that has a lot of upside, a lot of potential. We like card draw in Hearthstone, so this is certainly one to keep an eye on. All right, moving on over to Rogue. Here we have Jackpot, a new 2-mana spell in the Burgle family. It adds 2 random spells from other classes that are going to cost 5 or more to your hand. So a way to get a couple bigger spells. That is, you know, nice if you're planning a long game plan for a Thief Rogue deck. Like you want to make sure you have enough value and enough oomph behind your spells. You want to make sure your Contraband Stash and your Test Greymane have big payoff cards. And if you look at the 5-mana pool, you know, they all do something pretty big. There are still some pretty situational and limited cards. Like you're going to whiff sometimes, even though they're high cost. Sometimes you'll be happy you got like a Brawl or Flame Strike or Rune of the Archmage. Other times you're going to get things that are just hard to use or, you know, specific to certain classes or game plans, essentially, that don't fit yours. So it's not a home run every time, but higher than average quality compared to a lot of Burgle cards, which just have wider arrays and pools and such. That said, you know, you're taking a pretty big tempo loss and generating things that aren't going to pay off for a while. So big tempo hit here. It does reduce your Wild Paw Knoll by 2, so it pays back its cost a little bit, assuming you have a Knoll in hand, which could make it worth it. That said, I think the faster Thief Rogue decks that are popular right now aren't going to need to utilize a card like this one. I think you want something like Reconnaissance instead if you're going to run cards like that at all, because it pays back that mana more immediately, often gets you a minion to keep minion pressure on board. They often operate more through the board than through cards in hand. They don't want games to stretch out too awful long. They want to kind of pressure and overwhelm with Wild Paw Knolls and agents and such. So I don't think this fits into like the good versions of the deck. I think this fits into the fun versions of the deck. In other words, you're not going to see this at the top of the meta, but you're going to see me playing a ton of Jackpot. Moving on here, we have the Ink Veil Ambusher, a 2-mana 1/2 Naga for Rogue. It's got stealth and has +3 attack and immune while attacking. And I've heard this card's going to be a nightmare in Arena, taking all these clean trades with immune. Indeed, that sounds pretty terrifying. As far as standard is concerned, this is still a fairly intriguing card. It's a little straightforward. It's not a pirate, which goes against it right now for Rogue, but it is often just a very reliable 4 damage for 2 mana that still forces your opponent to deal with it as well. So it often will go 1-to-1 with some other kind of card or removal, and then also just probably squeeze in 4 damage. So I think if there's a really face-oriented Rogue deck, like just really smorky and really aggro-y, Ink Veil Ambusher could be pretty important in that world. Now, most Rogue decks don't play quite that like all in on face damage. They usually have some other kind of shenanigan, or they're like building towards damage in the mid game, where I think the Ink Veil Ambusher is a little bit less reliable. So I do think it's going to take a pretty niche scenario for this to be good in standard format. There's also a world where you just kind of plop this down and maybe like kill a school teacher with it later and you're kind of happy. But again, most decks are trying to do things more immediate and more direct than just kind of sitting on this and waiting for it to take good trades, of which, you know, it'll occasionally have on turn 2. But I think if anybody's playing this, they're probably thinking about it more as a face damage card, because a 4/2 for 2 isn't too bad. Now, it is susceptible to a trade after it attacks because it goes back to 1, and then your opponent might have like a 2/2 that trades pretty cleanly. Maybe it was still worth it for you, but again, I think you have to be a pretty face-oriented deck for that to make sense. So This card does a lot, has pretty big numbers for itself. That gives it potential, but I think it's very specific use cases that Inkveil Ambusher will succeed. All right, our final card here is the Shatter Shambler. Do 1 mana 1/3 for Rogue. Death Rattle synergy card. Battlecry, your next Death Rattle minion costs 1 less, but immediately dies when played. So essentially here, a discount and an activator for your Death Rattle. So I think the ideal use case is like Nerubian Egg style cards, where you want to play it and get a 4/4 right away instead of having to deal with or activate the Death Rattle later, just skipping through the egg part, essentially. There's also stuff like Naval Mine we've seen played a little bit in Rogue, just getting the 4 damage right away off the Shatter Shambler, if you please, while also, you know, discounting it, weaving it in. Now, this is only going to work with specific kinds of Death Rattles. There are some Death Rattles where the front half of the minion matters. You know, Talon comes to mind most immediately. Not that this is a Talon support card, obviously, but that's what I mean, is like you wouldn't want to play a Talon with this because you wouldn't want to lose your 3/3 and your Death Rattle. So it's stuff where you don't want the front half of the Death Rattle minion, right? Where the front half is the bad part and you want the back half for sure. So that does kind of cut the Death Rattle synergy options in this for in half, essentially, because a lot of Death Rattles just aren't going to fit the model here for Shatter Shambler. So that's a little bit of an issue. Beyond that, I just don't know that this card does quite enough. Like, yeah, it's a 1/3 at a base. That's fine. It's got a little discount baked in. Like, okay, you can play your Death Rattle a little sooner, sure. But, like, is that going to be enough value add to the deck? Is that really going to increment the game plan enough? This certainly doesn't feel like enough to push Death Rattle Rogue into, you know, meta relevance. This is not a strong enough card that suddenly Death Rattle Rogues are running rampant. So it's, you know, it's going to have to be a support piece as other things come along. And even then, like, if you're getting really powerful Death Rattle Rogue plays, is this going to feel like it's kind of up to the challenge of competing in that world? It just doesn't feel like it does a lot to me. It kind of feels like just a throwaway. There are discounts, though, so maybe there's some crazy setup where you play 2 of these and you have a Death Rattle that's discounted by 2, and somehow that opens up some kind of crazy combo or something. But I just don't really see this one coming together. I don't think the numbers are big enough. The discounts don't seem significant enough. There are sometimes downsides to this. The archetype isn't there yet. So all in all, this card feels like it has a lot of gaps to close if it wants to be competitive at all. I just don't really see the Shatter Shambler coming together. Drown is a 3-star card. Disarming Elemental is a 3-star card. Herald of Light is a 2-star card. Light Ray is a 3-star card. Frontlines is a 2-star card. Myrmidon is a 4-star card. Jackpot is a 2-star card. Inkveil Ambusher is a 3-star card. Shatter Shambler is a 2-star card. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for this round of reviews. We got 9 cards here. I think the remaining cards for the mini set are all getting revealed tomorrow, so stay tuned for more interesting cards. I think we have 1 legendary left as well to take a look at, so that'll be a big one. That said, thanks for hanging out. Curious to hear your thoughts on all these cards and more in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and until next time, game on.